In this Lords of the Fallen video, I'm going to be showing my Radiant Paladin build. This is a build that focuses on dealing high holy damage. It uses a bunch of spells in order to buff itself and deal damage at range, and also has very high defense and is very tanky. This is an extremely beginner-friendly build, not only because of the high damage and high defense, but also because it can be put together rather early on in the game, and it gets out of the gate rolling right along like pretty quickly, so you're able to like really get a lot of the benefits of this build like in the first 5 hours of the game or so. Before we get into the video, however, a big shout out to Hexworks Studios and CI Games for sponsoring this video. If you guys are picking up the game or considering picking up the game, use our link below to support the channel. So the class I chose to make this build with is the Orient Preacher, and there are a couple reasons for that. First, you begin with 18 Radiance. 18 Radiance is needed for the Radiant Weapon spell when you get to Skyrest Bridge, which is pretty quick in the game. That's how much Radiance you need in order to be able to use this spell. So already, by default, you have enough, although you could increase this on another class. I like starting with that. I also really like the fact that it starts with the Orient Preacher Hammer, and I'll get into why I really like this weapon in a second. But also, if you are starting with something like the Hallowed Knight and you want to do that, you can absolutely do that for this build. But you can buy the Hallowed Knight set very early on in the game once you reach Skyrest Bridge. So you're going to be able to replace your shield and armor when you get to Skyrest Bridge, and you'll also already have a Catalyst, and you'll be able to meet the requirements for the spells, which is why I like this. But you could use Hallowed Knight if you want, and then just buy the spells and Catalyst and increase your Radiance, or you could play Dark Crusader and do something similar. And I think the most compelling case, which I mentioned just a second ago for Orient Preacher, is the hammer that you get. This is a really good early game weapon. It has a very good move set. You'll notice that when you attack with R1, sometimes the hammer will actually end up slightly behind you, so if there are enemies behind you, you'll actually hit them if they're trying to hit you. So you kind of protect your back while you're swinging with this, which is really nice because a lot of times you're surrounded, which is good. It does kind of have a good cleave to it because it attacks kind of at a 45-degree angle, so you're able to hit multiple enemies. And the running R2 for this not only sweeps through lots of enemies, but it's absolutely devastating. You should get in the habit of using your running R2 instead of running R1 with this hammer. It's fantastic. And the scaling on it is predominantly Radiance, which is great because we're going to be pumping Radiance with this build, so we're going to get more damage out of it. And it does have a little bit of strength scaling as well, so if you want to put points into strength to help increase physical damage, you can. And there will be other options for weapons with this build. For instance, Pieda's Sword is not a bad option. It does only holy damage, though, so enemies that resist holy, it's going to be a bit of a tough time. But you can get this from her Remembrance from Molhu if you want to use that instead, although it's quite expensive. And then when it comes to your shield for this build, you're going to use the best you can find that doesn't that you meet the requirements for, that doesn't push you over the medium threshold. And early on, you can buy the Partisan Shield from Skyrest Bridge when you first get there, and you'll probably upgrade this to the Plain Shield and later on the Hollow Knight Shield once you find those. So you'll be just kind of steadily increasing this and increasing your strength to meet the requirements of these shields as necessary. And when it comes to your Catalyst, I like Agony's Light here. It has really, really high spell power for a Catalyst, much higher than the original Catalyst you begin the game with, or that you can buy from the Radiance guy in Skyrest Bridge early on in the game. This drops from the spiked head guys that are kind of walking around in the perch area of the game, so you can farm them. It took me about 10 to 15 kills to get one to drop from them, but it only has 3 slots. I only really use 3 spells for this build, so it's not that bad. But keep in mind that if you do want to use a Catalyst that has 4 slots, you'll probably have lower damage on your spells, but that won't affect Radiant Weapon. Radiant Weapon's damage is not affected by your Catalyst or spell power. It's only affected by your Radiant stat. So even if you're using a Catalyst with lower spell power, Radiant Weapon will still work as effectively. So you could do that if you have like 4 buff spells that you really like besides Radiant Weapon. And the 3 spells that I predominantly use for this build are Radiant Flare, Radiant Weapon, and Blessed Reflections. Radiant Flare is like your starting spell. It's a good all-around ranged damage spell that's cheap, that you can pick off ranged enemies with when they're being annoying, and it's just nice to have for that scenario, which happens sometimes. Radiant Weapon is your buff. Again, this is something you're going to be buffing with constantly to boost your damage. It gives you a significant damage boost. You want to try and keep this up as often as possible. Try and manage it so that, like, if you're doing some exploration through an area you've already been, you're not popping it, but if you know enemies are up ahead, you want to pop it before that. You want to try and keep this up in between vestiges as much as possible. And then Blessed Reflections, you can get this one from Molhu after you give him the Bowl of Revelations. This one costs 10 Umbral Scourings to get. It's not very expensive. What I really like about this is it hits really hard, and it has kind of a delay to it, so it allows you to cast it and then like run in for damage, and pop off some really good burst damage against a hard-to-kill enemy or boss for those scenarios where you need to just take them out real quick. There's another early game spell that you could use as well called Aura of Tenacity that gives you a lot of defense, and it's really good at keeping you alive. The issue I find with this spell is that it continuously drains your mana, And that means if you pop it for like a stretch, eventually you'll just run out of mana whether you need it or not, and then you'll have to use consumables to be able to do anything else. My strategy with this build is generally to try and kill things before they kill me, so I don't use this a lot, but it could be good in a boss fight after you buff your weapon, pop this, and try and kill that boss, be aggressive without having to buff your weapon a second time, or maybe you buff it one more time, but you don't need to buff it more than that. Now, there are obviously other spells you can use here. There's a heal you can get early on. It's not that effective in my opinion. I wouldn't go for it. There's some that affect status effects that aren't super useful. And there are other ones like the slash you can get. The slash has maybe double the damage for 4 times the mana as the Radiant Flare, which I don't really like. Has a very long cast time, but it does cleave through multiple enemies, so there might be a case for that. And there are a lot of other spells you'll get late game, but this is kind of an early to mid game build to get you going with your Paladin. By the time you reach level 50, which is where I ended this build, you'll have a good idea how this plays, and you'll know what's working for you and not. And then for Pendant, I like Relic of Perpetuation early on to give you even more HP. You really can't have enough HP or defense with this build because you're going to be really tanky with it. But I like swapping to the Empyrean Pendant later on for increased holy damage and holy defense. You can buy this from the Radiant Guy and Skyrest Bridge at a later point in the game. Getting more holy damage with your weapon that deals holy damage, with your buff that deals holy damage, your spells that deals holy damage is all good. So it's a good trade in my opinion. And the 2 rings that I'm using for this build are the Mine Owner's Ring, which increases your stamina and stamina regeneration. This is really good because you do block with this build. You do spend a lot of time running. You do run an R2. You do spam R1. Stamina is just all around good to have for any build, and stamina regeneration allows you to block and get your stamina back and attack more quickly. This one is found very, very early on in the game, so it's great. And then we also have Ring of Duty, which increases your endurance and vitality. You could probably replace this with something else when you find something better, but I haven't really found anything better at this point in the game. This is going to help with your equip load, give you more stamina, give you more health. All those are really good for this build. And when it comes to your armor, you can use really whatever you want as long as you're medium rolling. Obviously, you want to try and aim for the top of that medium roll threshold so that you have as much protection as possible, but you're still medium rolling. I'm using Fitzroy's armor here because with my stats, it puts me just under the heavy threshold, so I'm not fat rolling. Gives me a ton of physical protection, and it's really, really good for this build. So when looking at my attributes, you'll see that I've been prioritizing Radiance, and that's to meet requirements for spells to further boost the damage of my spells to give me more mana so I can cast my spells more often, like Radiant Weapon. These are all really good. Your damage on your weapon is also boosted by this. So Radiance is really what we're going for. If you use a weapon that's more Strength Radiance focused, that has more of a strength lean to it, you might want to prioritize strength some more than we're doing with this build. But that really depends on the weapon that you have. And one of the things that's really great early on is by prioritizing Radiance and really only putting enough strength in there to use the shields we want for the build, our spells are going to hit like a truck. They're going to do very, very well, just like a typical spellcaster would do. And then really what we're putting points in endurance and vitality for is to just keep us alive and to allow us to wear heavier armor and use a heavier shield and still medium roll. And you'll continue to increase your endurance in order to be able to medium roll as you use heavier and heavier armor sets and use heavier and heavier shields, or maybe pick up a different weapon that might be slightly heavier. And in that same vein, you might have to increase your strength some too as you get heavier shields in order to be able to wield those shields effectively. Now, once you hit 40 Radiance, you're going to hit a soft cap on mana. Like, the mana you gain is typically 7 mana every level up to level 40. Past level 40 in Radiance, you're only going to get like 3 or 4 mana. So you definitely want to get up to 40 Radiance, and then I would probably consider, getting your strength and endurance up more and looking for another weapon that's a bit better. Because this is a starting weapon. It's not exactly the best weapon you can use, but it's very, very good early on. And when it comes to early game rooms, I have one on my weapon that increases my Radiant scaling to further boost my damage a little bit on my weapon. Eventually, you'll probably want to replace this with holy damage if you can find one. And the one on my shield gives me strength scaling. That's just because that's what I could find at the moment, but you'll probably want to replace this later on for something that gives you like mana back or something like that, or further increases your Radiant stat. Something that's going to boost your damage or maybe your resources or protection in some way. You want to keep an eye out for those. That wraps up our Paladin build. This is a beginner-friendly build that I think will carry a lot of people through the early stretches of the game fairly well. And it is not like an endgame builder like that. You'll see that we're not using like really advanced stuff here, but I just wanted to give people a direction with some of these early builds that they can use right away. And then, as you learn the mechanics of the game, you'll be able to augment this build later, and we'll probably showcase some endgame builds as well later on in this channel to help give you ideas for those endgame builds as well. Stay tuned because we do have more builds coming on this channel. We have a Pyromancer build, we have an Umbral or Death build coming, and we're definitely going to have more like all-around physical builds as well. And remember that if you are picking up Lords of the Fallen, make sure to use our link below to support the channel. And as always, if you have tips for other players, you can leave them in the comments or questions, and I will try and answer them as soon as I can.